Because what we're always trying to do at All Tech is Human is bring together people across civil society, government, industry, and academia to tackle wicked tech and society issues while moving at the speed of tech. In other words, when we look at all these major issues that are going to be discussed over our 4 panel conversations today, so we're chock full. We want to give you a good deal for the free admission. We want to have this conversation, but also affect larger change, because when we look at artificial intelligence, it affects how we see the world. It affects who we vote for, how we get our news, how we go about our day, who we date, how we communicate at large. That is a big deal. One of the phrases that I oftentimes repeat at All Tech is Human is no application without representation. The idea that it shouldn't be about us without us. AI deeply impacts us. Therefore, it behooves us to ensure that a small sliver of society does not dictate the rules that impacts a diverse range of people. And more importantly, as you're going to see with today's conversation, everybody should be part of the AI conversation. When we actually look around this room, and then later on when you're at Brass Monkey, cheersing me with a beer, one of the things that you'll notice, and oftentimes can be surprising, is realizing that we have artists and designers and attorneys, advocacy groups, all different backgrounds who are coming together. But oftentimes, the question that we always get asked at All Tech is Human is effectively, if you boil it down, a question of, do I belong? Spoiler alert, yes, we all belong, right? Sometimes we have the tendency to mystify AI and treat it in this otherworldly type of capacity. And that really has the effect of pushing people out of the conversation. What we're trying to do here, and so thank you for all of your involvement, what we're always trying to do is say that this is about collective intelligence. This isn't about a few key individuals that you might see in the news. It's about all of us, because we all have lived experience of how we're being impacted by technology. We all have values that needed to be embedded into that technology. This is a new form of participation at the intersection of tech and democracy, as we'll see today. So I just want to encourage everyone here to stay involved. We've got working groups, summits, mixers, the Slack community that Sandra mentioned, a mentorship program that over 1,000 people have taken. This all happens because of people who are participating, paying their knowledge forward. In other words, I think we're moving away from this hyper-individualism towards understanding the power of community, right? And the power of collective intelligence, and the power to come together and change systems. So without further ado, I'd love to bring up who you just saw under Time Magazine, on the cover of Time Magazine for the top 100 in AI. We've got Rumman Chowdhury. So Rumman, let's give it up for Rumman. I know we have a packed schedule, but what we obviously are near and dear with the All Tech is Human community with Rumman's work is just her ability to understand and to project that everyone is part of this conversation, the ability to kind of come together and to also recognize that it's about us and it affects us. So Rumman, without further ado, thank you for taking part, and thank you for your partnership with Humane Intelligence, and I'll give over the mic.
Awesome. Oh, I get this one. All right. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite my, well, am I doing opening statements? Or am I just being the panelist on? As I, all right. Well, first I want to say thank you all for coming in this weather. I appreciate all of you braving thunderstorms, et cetera, to be here. Also, it's been a while since I've been in New York, and the last time I was here was during the pandemic. So it's lovely to be in a public space, because New York is such a wonderful place where so many different people of totally different backgrounds come together. And that's kind of how we've designed today's conversation on governing AI with David and All Tech is Human. And one of the reasons why Humane Intelligence wanted to work with All Tech is, as David said, they're the community builders and the conveners. They're all the kinds of people who who deserve a voice in the room and should be in the room. So all the conversations today are centered around different angles and different narratives of governance. So the first panel that I'm leading are actually with some very prominent people in government itself. So I have Amandeep Gill, who is the UN Tech Envoy, and Areeq Chowdhury, who is the head of data policy at the Royal Society. And we're going to be talking a little bit about governance. If they could please join me on stage. Oh, there they are. I think we're so please. You want to come over here? Well, thank you for joining. So just to kind of kick off, it's interesting when people think of government and government's role, there tends to be a lot of confusion around different levels and different layers of government and what is appropriate and not appropriate. So sort of a question to start off, and then we'll do more formal introductions. Can you talk a little bit about your background and your role, and what do you feel the role is of your organization in governance?
Sure. So first of all, great to be here. My name is Areeq. I don't consider myself to be an expert, first of all. So I kind of accidentally ended up in the space of tech policy about 10 years ago when I started researching the impact of the internet on democracy in a very positive light after the Arab Spring, and then ended up focusing on progressive tech policy over a number of years. And I've been at the Royal Society now for just under 3 years. But my focus is around policy. I very much don't believe there should be any kind of gatekeeping on any issue, AI, or any other topic on who should be involved. I mean, I very much agree that everyone should be involved in the policy discussions around tech. In the same way, you don't need to be, you don't need to know how to build a house to have an informed opinion on housing. You don't need to know how to design a tank to have an informed view on defense, or bake a cheesecake to know about food poverty. I feel very much the same about AI. And the Royal Society's role, if you're not aware, we're the oldest scientific institution in the world, going for 360 years, and we're the UK's National Academy of Science. And our role is to convene leading scientists. So we have the fellows of the Royal Society who are elected by their peers, and most famous ones being Isaac Newton, Einstein, Stephen Hawking. And we convene them around policy issues and get the voice of the scientific community to discuss tech policy. But even they, I would say, are only experts in their own field. So they're only experts in their specific areas. And our role is to really sort of navigate the policy landscape for them. So what I would say is there's loads of uncertainty in this space. And if I'm completely honest, I don't think anyone really knows the answers on how to govern AI. But I think there's lots of lessons from different policy areas, and we try to do that at the Royal Society, and I try to do that in my role.
Please.
So you're all familiar with the United Nations, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That was the starting point in 1945. And currently the UN has a 3-pillar mission. One is peace and security, and the other is human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the third one is sustainable development. So almost all UN actions on governance can be looked at under those 3 categories. In the field of technology, the UN's role has often focused on technologies that pose a high level of risk in terms of misuse, whether it's nuclear energy, space, can be used for missiles. And on digital, it has been a different journey for the past 20 odd years. So it has been more multi-stakeholder, which means it's not only governments that come into the discussion, it's civil society, it's the private sector. It's been about governing the internet for everyone's benefit. So it's not only about risks and misuse, but also about equal opportunities to bridging what's called the digital divide. And the AI discussion is relatively new in the UN. When I say relatively, it goes back at least 6 to 7 years. The AI for Good Summit at the International Telecommunications Union looking at the opportunities for making progress on sustainable development, but also the ethics discussion at UNESCO, how to drive governance through an ethical lens, the human rights discussion, where countries have undertaken some commitments, And one discussion that I chaired some years back, that was on lethal autonomous weapons, which means the application of artificial intelligence in the weapons space, and how do we make sure that AI weapons do not take life autonomously without regard for some of the principles that are embedded in international humanitarian law.
So it's interesting because both of you represent organizations with a very long history and yet, are sort of independent of government. What's the benefit of the long history you have, but also being an influential group, but not specifically a government entity? What's the special role that your organization can play?
Yeah, so one of the so the Royal Society has a number of roles. It does stuff around like public engagement, book prizes, giving out grants. It's got an academic journal, and then it's got this science policy directorate, which is where I sit in leading our data and digital tech team. And one of the objectives of the organisation is to provide independent advice to not just the UK government, but to other international organisations. And I think if you're in the government, I think civil servants value just an impartial, non-political insight on what the evidence is on a certain issue. So the first and primary objective at the Royal Society is to say, here is what the evidence is on a certain policy issue that you're interested in. And then secondly is some suggestions of different policy initiatives that they can take forward. And if you're in government, first of all, if you want to advocate something internally but can't, it's helpful to have an independent organisation say the things you can't say within government. But secondly, it's really hard to find good evidence sometimes, especially on an emerging issue like AI, where every week there's a different sort of hype going on, or there's just not much evidence base around AI safety or bias or whatever else it might be. Misinformation is a good example. We do a lot of work on that. So we did a project last year on misinformation. Most of it was basically presenting the evidence around echo chambers, the evidence that people are even influenced by what they read online, the evidence that misinformation is an issue. And that report actually said that as an issue, it's kind of overstated. Like it's a real issue. So we looked at vaccine misinformation primarily. And, we found that it's an issue amongst the margins, but not necessarily an issue amongst the masses. And you saw in the UK, at least, high uptake of vaccines. And, another finding was that a lot of the research is skewed towards the US, which is very polarized. So I think the value is just independent takes on certain issues.
Yes, very similar to that. So providing a neutral, independent platform for countries to come together and start discussing issues. So a bit like an umpire in a game, because nations have competing interests. Often they are hostile to each other's interests. So providing that space where convenings can happen, and also where knowledge can be constructed together. Take the issue of climate change, for instance. So over a period of time, the UN has driven a process that has built up a scientific consensus on what's happening to our climate and what could be done about that. And similarly, at another level, it's a space which can help you reach hard law. So treaties, conventions, and softer forms of law in terms of declarations, political charters, and commitments. So currently we have this process underway to put together a global digital compact, the issue of misinformation, disinformation, internet fragmentation, data protection, all the set of digital issues, human rights online, the digital divide. So they are being considered there so that next year when leaders meet at the Summit of the Future, you can have a charter with a shared vision of a future, digital future, which is hopefully open, free, secure, and inclusive. And similarly, just recently, the Secretary General has announced the formation of a global multi-stakeholder advisory body on AI. So what's the risk? So to build a kind of scientific consensus on the risk landscape, on the opportunities landscape, on the governance landscape, because different jurisdictions are taking their own approach. The EU's AI Act, the White House commitments with those 7 companies. So how can we build more interoperability, connectivity across these different governance initiatives? And how can we align them with our fundamental values, which are there in the UN Charter, fundamental freedoms, human rights, cultural diversity, so those kind of issues. So it's horizontal alignment as well as vertical alignment with fundamental human rights and values. So those are the kind of value addition that the UN brings to this space.
So, how bold do you think the UN should be? Now there's a conversation about global governance, but not just governance as soft power, but actually global regulatory bodies or licensing groups, et cetera. Do you feel that maybe the UN should have more of a say or more governance, or what are the pros and cons of even that narrative?
Right. So I think at the UN, we should be humble about the role we can play. The UN is certainly not a very agile instrument. Treaty making takes time. Consensus building across 193 countries can be difficult. So sometimes you can move faster in smaller groups. So you have to have a mix, a blend of approaches. And I often like to think of governance of technology as a tiered, distributed project where you have an international level, you have a national level, and the industry level. And I don't mean to imply any hierarchy here. At the international level, there is a role for principles and common frameworks like the Global Digital Compact, the principles that were adopted on lethal autonomous weapon systems, such as international human rights apply, regardless of the kind of technology that you're dealing with. So there is that role. Perhaps there's some role for hard norms as well. Thou shall not have fully autonomous weapon systems that take life on their own without any human accountability or control. Perhaps we can all agree on that. So there you get hard law, but the rest of it is soft law. And then the bulk of the governance response comes at the national level. And then because this field is led by the private sector, the human resource, the compute capacity, the data is often there. So that level, including civil society, has a role. Codes of conduct, ethical certification schemes, accountability mechanisms of other kinds. And all these 3 levels have to come together in an agile and responsive way because tech is moving fast and you have this pacing problem.
Right. And, you've pointed out that deliberation takes time. And one of the common things that keeps coming up is that governance needs to move faster or innovations outpacing government or governance. So where do you lie in that conversation? Question for either of you. Should policy be moving faster? Should innovation be moving slower? Is it possible to even have deliberation across over 100 different countries in a faster way?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. So I definitely think international collaboration should be an aspiration that we seek to achieve, but it's not going to, like I said, it's not going to happen overnight. And therefore, each country does need to kind of think, if they do want to regulate these technologies, which not every country does want to, how can they do so effectively? But also, what issue are they actually trying to solve? So that's something that we try to think about at the Royal Society is, as a starting point for any policy project that we do, is like, what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And in a previous life before I joined the Royal Society, I did some work on facial recognition surveillance. And in London, I'm not sure if you're aware, in London the police use facial recognition surveillance, and they also use it in Wales and another part of the UK. And the issue there, if you're thinking about the policy problem, can be quite a local one. So if you're thinking about, do we want to reduce the public space that people have and reduce people's privacy and move along the sort of security scale towards greater surveillance, and who suffers from that? And then the work that I was doing at the time was looking at racial bias and its application. So not in the technology itself, but who is facial recognition going to be targeted at, which communities, who's going to be on the watch list, who's going to be stopped, who's going to be incorrectly stopped, and which areas are going to be targeted. And all of those, if you look at the rest of the justice landscape, is disproportionately affecting certain communities. And therefore, if you're starting from that point, you've got to start really local in what you're trying to solve. You need to start with the police first, wipe out racial bias in the police before you do it in the technology. or you need to start locally. So I think I admitted from my introduction, I'm also a politician, a local politician in East London, and we're trying to look at this issue locally in our council. Like, what can the council do? There's lots of different players who can play short-term roles that don't need to wait for these huge international agreements. So I think there's lots of different
So I think what
players.
you're getting at is, fundamentally to an extent, a diversity of policy is a net good thing. I think there is such an emphasis on creating unity among all policy that maybe we should all consider that. We should also consider that, from place to place, it is good to have degree of variation because, as you mentioned, context is very, very different locally. It's interesting because when people talk about racial bias in algorithmic systems, they're usually talking about improving the system so that it works better, right? And that's, I think what you're talking about is that would be a very naive take in your case.
Yeah, I actually think it's a trap. So, like, I really respect all of the focus on racial bias within technology, but I do think it's a trap in the sense that we're setting the success criteria as accurate tools of oppression, whereas really you should be thinking, do you want these tools of oppression in the first place? So, like, we have tasers in the UK, I don't know if we have them here in the US, but tasers work accurately on people of all races, but they're used disproportionately against people of color. And we have to think this way about the different technologies that we're talking about. When we're talking about facial recognition surveillance, do you want it to be accurate or do you want it to be used at all? And that's the first question that should be asked. But I think by setting the criteria as wiping out bias in the technology, I mean, maybe this is specific to facial recognition, it might be different on things like search engines. But, we might be setting the wrong success criteria, and I think that is maybe a trap that we might be falling into.
So one question I have actually about the UN's role, often governance is framed as ensuring harm doesn't happen, but the UN actually plays a very specific role in my opinion. It also points towards a positive future. So do you think the role of the UN in this governance scheme could be also helping create technology for human flourishing versus saying governance as ensuring bad things don't happen? Specifically, what I'm getting at is there's a difference between saying we're stopping bad things versus we are making good things.
Definitely, because the governance discussion at any level is not only about harm and risks and preventing bad things from happening, but it's also about good things happening and having equal access to opportunities. And that's why education systems are built around the world. And that is the aspect of, in a sense, you have misuse on the one hand, but there's also misuse. So if you don't have access to the internet, if you don't have meaningful, affordable access to data, then you're left out of the digital economy, and that has implications. Just as we've seen on the gender issue, women lag behind men in terms of financial inclusion. So those are the things that the UN also has to consider. I think everyone has to consider. To your point about can we slow down innovation? Perhaps not. I think policymakers, public policy needs to catch up. There has to be more investment in public tech, in public sector literacy, understanding of these technologies. Of course, there will be areas, we don't allow germline editing. We don't allow certain kind of health experiments on ethical, moral grounds. So there have to be some no-go areas for innovation. But we have to come to that through a degree of scientific consensus building and collaboration. And context will differ. Specific solutions would differ, but it would benefit if we could sit together and at least exchange experiences, lessons learned, what to do, what not to do.
Well, I'm glad you're talking about scientific consensus. Now it's sort of as I was saying, as we were warming up in the speaker room, the spicy component of this conversation. The community is fractured at the moment, right? We have people who are talking and thinking about existential risk, safety with a capital S, security with a capital S. We were joking that there's certain words you can't say anymore because they hold a wealth of meaning. And then there are the folks that have been working on responsible use, et cetera. So especially as the Royal Society, as both of you have mentioned, this idea of scientific consensus and scientific approaches. Let's talk about that for a minute. Like, are you seeing this divide even amongst your communities? Is it just in the responsible AI space or the people who are entering AI at the moment? And how do you feel we balance this then, or do we not balance it?
Yeah, it's really hard. So in the Royal Society, it's probably one of the hardest things actually that I have to think about, because on the one hand, there's the fellows that we talk to often. So, usually London-based, tend to agree with each other. And we convened a dinner a few months ago of some of our key AI fellows, and there was general agreement amongst them that existential risk is kind of science fiction and a distraction from shorter term risk. And I remember there was one fellow who said the existential risk of AI is that it speeds up the warming of the planet and wipes us out that way. But then on the other hand, other fellows include Elon Musk, Jeffrey Hinton, other signatories of the pause letter. And I've met with some of them, not met with Elon Musk. They I haven't tried. It's actually on the he's like a restricted contact on our system. I don't know who actually can speak to him in our organization. The ones who do believe that this is going to wipe out humanity, it's super convincing, and it's actually quite hard to argue with them just based on their own expertise. So in terms of consensus, you have to take a position at some point. I think, first of all, one position is that there is uncertainty and we should prepare for different scenarios. And another more useful framework, I think, is to think about, short to medium term likely risks that may be getting lost in the current conversations around existential risk. And if we're to talk, so in the UK, I'm not sure if you're aware, because I don't know how much this has landed outside of the UK, but we are hosting the Global AI Safety Summit, which is an initiative of the UK government. But most of that conversation is focusing on long-term, or appears to be focusing on long-term risk. So we are, as a Royal Society, trying to focus a little bit more on short to medium-term risk, and there may be more consensus around the risk that we can see coming in the next 10 years rather than the ones that may be coming in.
Oh yes,
50,
and you
60
reminded
years.
me we were supposed to be making the
Should we make it
announcement.
now?
Yes, do it.
So very pleased that Rumman and Rumman's organisation, Humane Intelligence, and the Royal Society will be collaborating on a event in the run-up to the Global AI Safety Summit, which will be a red teaming exercise modelled on the one that she ran at DEF CON. It'll be a much smaller scale, but we are looking at scientific misinformation and looking at the guardrails of large language models around climate and vaccine misinformation, which hopefully, if successful, will help bring some more attention to the shorter term risk. So very excited about that, and
Yes.
you should hopefully hear more detail about it soon.
Yes. So I don't want to take away from the rest of the conversation, but yes, we're very excited about that. So as Areeq mentioned, we're going to be doing our next red teaming exercise. It's more structured like a traditional red teaming exercise with scientific experts from Royal Society, as well as, students coming in to actually identify scientific misinformation around COVID and climate, or on large language models. And our hope is that we have a report for the Safety Summit that actually pushes the narrative a little bit away from will AI wake up and blow up the world, and more to the things that actually concern and may impact people today. So, but I wanted to also, talk a bit about the UN and, the purpose of whether or not this existential risk is a narrative or a conversation, or where do you see the UN falling as an organization as you think of global governance of AI?
I would be careful to get into this doomerism in a sense. I think we have some known risks. We have a clear set of issues that are right here with us. There is misinformation, disinformation. The amount of synthetic media content is going to grow exponentially. There is the aspect of disruption in the job market. That has always happened with tech, but this time it may happen faster. Just look at the change in the tone of the media on AI, because AI is now coming for jobs in the media sector as well. So from hype, it has come down a few notches. You have the impact in terms of the misuse of these systems to come up with new chemicals, potentially biological molecules as well that could cause harm. So the entire non-state actor misuse of bio and chem takes on a different dimension with the use of advanced AI. techniques. So we have to deal with these. And in the longer term, I think there is societal disruption. We already have seen with smartphones and social media how our social interactions have changed. There is an epidemic of loneliness and mental health problems today, sleeplessness in children that we hadn't bargained for. And it is having subtle but clear impact on societal well-being. So what happens with AI, we have to keep an eye on that in the medium term. The longer term risks, of course, we can't just shut our eyes to them. So we need a kind of a risk watch functionality, a kind of lighthouse role. But I think our efforts, our focus should be on what is there here and now, and maybe 3 to 5, 7 years into the future.
So just as we wrap up the panel, what's the next immediate thing that your organization can impact positively in the world of AI governance? What's the thing the Royal Society is going to contribute, and what's the thing the UN is going to contribute?
Yeah, I'd say the Royal Society is actually quite an optimistic organization on tech, and I would see myself as optimistic. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment on the role of AI in scientific research. So we're looking at how AI is changing the nature and methods of scientific research, and we'll be publishing a report in March, which will set out some thoughts on things like large language models and other issues. We're doing a piece of work, a new project on disability technology and disability data, looking at the technologies that could exist but don't, and looking at the potential of things like low-shot machine learning, and thinking about the impacts it could have there. Continuing to do work on misinformation, such as the work we're doing together, but we're also looking at things like information literacy as a sort of long-term solution to misinformation. And we're also doing a lot of work on privacy-enhancing technologies, which is a suite of techniques to gain insights from data without needing to access it or share it. And that could be another technological way of governing some of these technologies. But we're looking at these in a very specific sort of area by area way. And we've also submitted to the Global Digital Compact. So I'm sure you've read it in great detail, our consultation response.
Yes, 7,000 plus inputs. Yes. Actually, we had AI work on it as well, some human supervision. Now, for us, there are two immediate priorities. One is the advisory body, the Global AI Advisory Body on AI, which has to submit its first interim report by the end of the year. So the risk landscape, the opportunities landscape, the governance landscape, what do previous models of tech governance tell us about our future steps on AI governance, whether from the nuclear domain, the civil aviation domain, the maritime domain, other domains. And the other priority is advancing on what we call AI and data commons, where algorithmic expertise, data sets, human resource comes together to solve urgent SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals related problems, agriculture, food security, universal health coverage, the green transition, and so on. So both the misuse side and the misuse side.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And on to our next panel. If you have any questions, you can find the speakers around later, and please feel free. So thank you very much, everybody.